The sky over Carmel by the sea was still dark, the kind of quiet dark that only exists in small coastal towns just before dawn. The ocean whispered against the shore a few blocks away, but here on Ocean Avenue, the only sounds were the hum of delivery trucks, the clink of coffee cups, and the occasional radio crackle from security teams setting up for the film festival. Among them stood a man in a navy blue uniform, his posture straight but his eyes heavy. He'd been on his feet since 3 a.m., checking barricades, testing walkie-talkie channels, and making sure the velvet ropes were perfectly aligned. He wasn't famous. No one clapped when he walked by. But to the event organizers he was reliable, steady, calm, the kind of person you forget is there until something goes wrong, and then you're glad he is. He'd done this kind of work for over 10 years. Before that, he'd worn a different uniform, camouflage, boots, a rifle slung over his shoulder in places most Americans only saw on the news. Back then people called him Sir or Sergeant. Now they barely said his name. Not that he minded. He liked the quiet, liked knowing his job was simple: keep people safe, stay out of the way, do what's right without needing applause. But lately, the quiet had started to feel heavier. It wasn't just the long hours or the early mornings. It was the silence at home, the empty chair at the kitchen table, the way the house still smelled faintly of lavender, her favorite weeks after she was gone. She'd fought hard, longer than the doctors expected. He'd sat by her bedside every night after his shifts, holding her hand, reading old letters, sometimes just watching her breathe. When she passed, it wasn't sudden, but it still felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. The bills kept coming: hospital statements, insurance denials, final notices. He'd sold the car she loved, cut back on everything, even skipped meals so his son could eat well. Pride kept him from asking for help, and duty kept him showing up day after day, even when his chest felt like it was wrapped in chains. This morning, though, something was off. As the first VIP shuttle approached, blacked-out windows, tinted like secrets, he stepped forward to check credentials. His hands were steady, his voice was clear, but inside a familiar tightness began to coil in his chest. It started small, like a knot in his throat. Then his breath got shallow. The streetlights seemed too bright. The voices around him, chatter about camera angles, guest lists, coffee orders, suddenly sounded muffled, like he was underwater. He tried to focus on the task, scan the badge, nod, step aside. But his fingers fumbled. The radio slipped from his grip and clattered onto the pavement. He bent to pick it up, but his knees wouldn't cooperate. A wave of dizziness hit him. He leaned against the metal barricade, eyes closed, trying to breathe like the therapist had taught him. Slow in, slow out. But his heart was pounding like it wanted out of his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He opened his eyes just in time to see a woman in a designer coat snap a photo with her phone. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just kept walking, already tapping out a message. He straightened up as quickly as he could, face burning. "I'm fine," he muttered to no one in particular, brushing dust off his sleeve. No one responded. The crew moved on. The shuttle rolled past. The festival didn't stop for one man's moment of weakness, but the moment had been caught. By noon, a 12-second clip was circulating online. Grainy, shaky, shot from a distance, but clear enough. A security guard mid-shift, collapsing against a barrier, looking lost, overwhelmed, broken. The caption read, "Festival guard can't handle the pressure. Guess he's not cut out for the job." Within an hour, it had thousands of views. Comments poured in, "Should have stayed home if he can't do the job." "This is why I don't trust private security. Looks like he was drunk or something." He didn't know any of this yet. He'd finished his shift, turned in his gear, and walked the half-mile back to his apartment above a closed bookstore. The walk usually calmed him. Today it felt like dragging an anchor. He poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall where her photo used to hang. He'd taken it down last week, not because he didn't miss her, but because seeing her smile made the silence louder. His phone buzzed. A message from his supervisor. "Hey, we saw the video. HR wants you to take a few days off. Just a precaution. We'll talk Monday." He read it 3 times. Each time it felt colder. Precaution. Like he was a risk. Like his pain was a liability. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shuttle, the phone camera, the way people had looked away. Not with concern, with judgment. He thought about calling his son, but what would he say? Dad had a bad morning? His son was already stressed about college applications and part-time work. He didn't need his father's burdens added to his own. The next morning, the video had gone viral. Local news picked it up. National blogs reposted it with clickbait headlines: "Security guard meltdown at star-studded event." Talk show hosts joked about emotional bodyguards. One commentator said, "If you can't keep it together in public, maybe you shouldn't be guarding celebrities." He stayed inside. Pulled the blinds. Let the calls go to voicemail. Even the neighbor's dog, who usually barked at squirrels, seemed quieter, as if sensing the weight in the air, but not everyone saw the clip the same way. In a quiet house on the edge of town, nestled among cypress trees and ocean fog, an older man watched the video on his tablet. He'd lived in Carmel for decades, walked its streets, supported its schools, quietly helped veterans when no cameras were around. He wasn't one for social media, but his assistant had sent him the link with a note. "Thought you'd want to see this." The man, known to the world as a Hollywood legend, but to his neighbors simply as Clint, watched the clip without blinking. He didn't laugh, didn't scroll past. He rewound it, watched it again. This time he didn't see weakness. He saw something else entirely. He saw a man who'd given years of his life to serve others, first his country, then his community, now crumbling under a weight no one could see. He saw the stiff way the guard held himself even while falling, the way he tried to recover instantly as if trained to never show pain. Clint knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after his own father passed. He'd seen it in fellow actors after tough roles, in soldiers at USO events, and friends who'd lost spouses and never spoke of it again. Most people saw a failure. Clint saw courage, just of a different kind. He set the tablet down and walked to his study. On the wall hung a black and white photo of him in his younger days, squinting into the sun on a movie set. Below it, a framed letter from a Marine thanking him for visiting a VA hospital. He'd never talked about those visits, never posted them online. To him, helping wasn't about being seen. It was about doing what was right. Now something needed to be done, but he wouldn't rush. Clint wasn't the type for grand gestures or viral tweets. He believed in action, not noise. And before he acted, he needed to understand the full story. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Someone who knew the local security companies, who could find out who the man in the video really was, not just what the internet said he was. As he waited for the call to connect, he looked out the window at the Pacific, gray and endless. He thought about how easy it was for people to judge a moment without knowing the years that led to it. How quick the world was to tear someone down for showing they were human, and he made a quiet decision. This wouldn't end with a meme. Not if he could help it. Meanwhile, back in the small apartment above the bookstore, the man who'd become an internet punchline sat on his couch, staring at his boots. He didn't know it yet, but his story wasn't over. In fact, it was about to take a turn no one, least of all him, could have predicted. And it would start with a phone call from a voice he never expected to hear. The phone rang just after 7 a.m., a sharp, unfamiliar sound in the quiet apartment. He almost didn't answer. These days, most calls were either bill collectors or reporters trying to get a quote about the video. But something made him reach for it. Maybe just habit, maybe a sliver of hope that it could be his son checking in. "Hello?" he said, voice rough from sleep and silence. There was a pause on the other end. Not the kind of pause filled with background noise or hesitation, but a calm, steady silence, like someone choosing words carefully. "This is Clint Eastwood," the voice said, low and gravelly, but clear. "I saw what happened at the festival." He froze. For a second he thought it was a prank, maybe one of those AI voice scams, but the tone was too real, too grounded. "And why would someone fake this call? I don't understand," he managed. "I'm calling because I think you've been treated unfairly," Clint said, no fluff, no preamble, "and because I've been where you are." He sat down hard on the edge of his couch, phone pressed tight to his ear. Outside, a seagull cried. Inside, the only sound was his own breathing. Clint didn't ask for his life story, didn't pry. Instead, he talked about his early days in Hollywood, how he'd once thrown up backstage before a live TV appearance because the pressure felt like it was crushing his ribs. How he'd learned to hide it, to push through, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. "People think toughness means never bending," he said. "But real strength is knowing when you're bent and still showing up." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through something deep inside him. No one had spoken to him like that in months. Not since she'd been gone. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," he said quietly. "I just couldn't catch my breath." "You don't owe anyone an explanation," Clint replied. "But I want you to know you're not alone." Then came the part he never saw coming. "There's a veterans wellness program I help support," Clint said. "Counseling, medical help, even financial guidance. No cameras, no interviews. Just people who've been through hell and came out the other side. I'd like you to talk to them. On me." He opened his mouth to protest, to say he didn't need charity, but Clint cut in gently. "This isn't charity. It's respect. You served. You're still serving. That matters." They talked for another 10 minutes, about the ocean, about Carmel, about how quiet the town gets in winter. Normal things. Human things. By the time they hung up, his hands weren't shaking anymore. But the world outside hadn't changed. While he'd been on the phone, the video had exploded again. A late-night talk show had played it during a blooper reel segment, laughing as they cut to dramatic music. A popular podcast debated whether emotional instability should disqualify someone from security work. His employer, Pacific Shield Security, had issued a bland statement. "We take all incidents seriously and are conducting a full review." Translation: "We're distancing ourselves." That afternoon, a letter arrived in his mailbox. Official-looking, printed on company letterhead. He tore it open with numb fingers. It confirmed what he'd feared. He was placed on administrative leave pending wellness evaluation. They weren't firing him outright, but the message was clear. His reliability, his defining trait, was now in question. He sat at the kitchen table, the paper in his hand, and stared out the window. Rain had started to fall, soft and steady, blurring the bookstore sign below. He thought about all the times he'd stood in rain like this, guarding stages, red carpets, backstage doors, always invisible, always present. Now he was visible for all the wrong reasons. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his son. "Dad," the voice said, tight with worry. "People at school are talking. Someone posted that video in the group chat. They're saying stuff." He closed his eyes. "I'm okay, son. It's just a misunderstanding." "But it's not fair," his son said, voice cracking slightly. "You've worked so hard. You never complain." "Why are they acting like you did something wrong?" He didn't have an answer. Not a good one, anyway. So he said what he always said. "Just keep your head down. Focus on your work. Things'll settle." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. That evening, he scrolled through his phone for the first time in days. He saw the memes. Photoshopped images of him fainting into a popcorn bucket. Captions like "Guard needs a nap." He saw comments calling him unprofessional, a liability, probably on meds. One person even claimed he'd been drinking on duty. He wanted to scream. To post a response. To explain about the sleepless nights, the grief that sat in his chest like a stone, the way his body sometimes betrayed him even when his mind was sharp. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The internet didn't want truth, it wanted a story. And his truth didn't fit the narrative. So he turned off his phone and sat in the dark. But Clint hadn't forgotten. The next morning, a discreet black sedan pulled up outside the apartment. No logos, no fanfare. A man in a plain suit stepped out carrying a small envelope. He knocked once, waited, then left it in the mailbox when there was no answer. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, cream-colored paper. "Don't let the noise drown out your worth. Call the number below. They're expecting you. See." Beneath it was a phone number and the name of a local clinic he'd never heard of, but one that he'd later learned had helped dozens of veterans dealing with PTSD, grief, and burnout. No press, no paperwork circus. Just help. He almost didn't call. Pride is a stubborn thing. But that night, after another sleepless stretch, he dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, unhurried. She didn't ask for his name right away. Just said, "We've been waiting for you." Over the next few days, small things began to shift. He met with a counselor, a former Navy medic who spoke like he'd walked through fire and knew the way out. They didn't talk about the video. They talked about loss, about how grief doesn't follow a schedule, about how asking for help isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing a person can do. Meanwhile, the online storm raged on. But something unexpected happened. A retired police officer posted a thread on social media. "I've had panic attacks on duty. So have half the guys I served with. We just hid it. This man didn't hide it, and now he's being crucified for being human." The post went viral. Then a nurse shared her own story. Working 16-hour shifts during the pandemic, collapsing in a hospital stairwell, being filmed by a patient's relative. "No one asked if I was okay," she wrote. "They just posted it online like I was a joke." Slowly, the tide began to turn. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough that some people started to question the rush to judgment. Still, his employer stayed silent. His leave continued, and the festival moved on without him, as if he'd never been there. He tried not to take it personally, but it hurt. Not because he needed the spotlight, but because he'd always believed that doing your job well, quietly, with integrity, was enough. Now he wasn't so sure. Then came the invitation. It arrived by email, a formal note from the Carmel Film Festival organizers. They were holding their opening gala that weekend at the historic Sunset Center. Clint Eastwood would be receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, and they wanted him, yes, him, to attend as a guest of honor. He read it 3 times, thought it was a mistake, called the number at the bottom. A polite assistant confirmed it was real. Mr. Eastwood insisted, she said. He almost said no. The idea of walking into a room full of cameras, celebrities, and people who'd seen the video, it made his stomach twist. But then he remembered Clint's words. Real strength is knowing when you're bent and still showing up. So he said yes. He didn't have a tuxedo. Didn't own a suit nice enough for a gala. But the next day, a package arrived at his door. Tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, even polished shoes. No note, just his size perfectly fitted. As he tried it on in front of the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Not because of the clothes, but because for the first time in months he didn't see a broken man. He saw someone who'd been knocked down and was still standing. He didn't know what would happen at the gala. Didn't know if people would whisper, point, or look away. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going as a cautionary tale. He was going as himself, flawed, grieving, human, and that was enough. And somewhere across town, an old actor in a simple suit was preparing to say a few words that would change everything. Not just for him, but for thousands of others watching from their living rooms, feeling just as invisible. The stage was set, not for a spectacle, but for a moment of truth, and America was about to be stunned, not by drama, but by decency. The Sunset Center in Carmel glowed under soft golden lights, its Spanish-style arches draped in ivy and fairy lights for the film festival's opening gala. Inside, the air hummed with the clink of champagne glasses, the murmur of industry talk, and the rustle of expensive fabric. Cameras flashed near the entrance as directors, actors, and producers arrived, all dressed in their finest, smiling for the red carpet like nothing in the world weighed on them. He stood near the back of the auditorium, just inside the double doors, still in his borrowed suit. He hadn't planned to stay long. Just show up, thank Clint quietly if he got the chance, then slip out before anyone noticed. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. The hush that fell over a small group near the bar when they recognized him. A few turned away quickly. One woman whispered something to her companion and pointed discreetly. His stomach tightened. He almost turned around right then. But then he saw him. Clint Eastwood stood near the stage, not in a tuxedo, but a simple dark suit, hands in his pockets, talking calmly with a festival organizer. He looked older than on screen, more weathered, more real, but his presence filled the room without him trying. And when he spotted the man in the back, he didn't wave or call out. He just gave a small, firm nod, like he was saying, "You belong here." That nod held him in place. He found an empty seat in the last row, far from the cameras and the clusters of famous faces. He kept his head down, hands folded in his lap, trying to disappear again, but his heart wouldn't slow. Every laugh, every burst of applause felt like it was echoing inside his chest. The program began with a short film tribute, then a series of awards. People gave speeches full of gratitude and inside jokes. The audience laughed, clapped, wiped away tears. It all felt like another world, one he'd protected from the outside but never truly entered. Then came the main event. A hush fell as the MC stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, voice warm but steady. Tonight we honor a man whose work has shaped cinema for over 6 decades. But more than that, we honor a man who has quietly shaped this community, who shows up not for the spotlight but for the people. The crowd rose to their feet before she even said his name. Applause rolled through the room like ocean waves, and Clint walked onto the stage slow and unhurried as if he had all the time in the world. He took the microphone, glanced up. "Thank you," he began, voice rough but clear. "I've been lucky to tell stories, to work with great people, to call this beautiful town home." He paused, looked out over the audience. "But tonight I don't want to talk about movies." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. This wasn't the speech they expected. "I want to talk about something we don't see enough of," he continued. "Something we pretend doesn't happen, especially in a town like this, where everything's polished, perfect, and posted online before it's even real." He shifted his weight, hands resting lightly on the podium. "Last week, a man did his job. He showed up early in the cold before anyone else cared. He stood his post while the rest of us slept. And then, just for a moment, he couldn't stand anymore. The room went still. Cameras stopped clicking. Even the waiters froze. Some people filmed that moment," Clint said, voice dropping lower, "and turned it into a joke, called him weak, said he wasn't cut out for the job." He looked directly toward the back of the room, toward the last row, toward the man in the borrowed suit. "But I'll tell you what I saw," Clint said. "I saw someone who's carried more than most of us ever will, who's lost someone he loved, who's worked himself to the bone to keep his head above water, and who, even when his body said stop, still tried to get back up." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone in still water. "The real heroes," he said slowly, "aren't always on screen. Sometimes they're the ones holding the line when no one's watching, and especially when they're hurting." For a long moment there was silence. Not awkward silence, reverent silence, like the whole room had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. Then, from the front row, an older woman in a sequined dress stood up. She clapped once, then again. Others followed. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding. Not for Clint, but for the idea he'd just named. For the invisible people. For the ones who serve quietly and suffer silently. He sat in his seat, stunned. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. For the first time in months, he didn't feel ashamed of them. After the applause faded, Clint stepped away from the mic, gave a small bow, and walked off stage, not to the VIP lounge, but straight down the center aisle. People parted for him like he was walking through water. He didn't stop until he reached the last row. He extended a hand. "Come on," he said, quiet enough that only the man could hear. "Let them see you." He hesitated. "I don't want to make a scene." "You already did," Clint said, not unkindly. "Now let it mean something." So he stood. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't take photos. They just looked at him, at Clint, at each other, and nodded. Some smiled. Others had tears in their eyes, too. In that moment, he wasn't the security guard who broke down. He was just a person, and that was enough. Later, as the gala wound down, a reporter from a major news network approached him. "Can we get a comment?" she asked gently. "People are talking about what Mr. Eastwood said." He thought about it, then shook his head. "Not tonight," he said, "but maybe soon." He walked out into the cool night air, the ocean breeze brushing his face. The street was quiet now. The red carpet rolled up, the lights dimmed. But something had shifted, not just in the town, but in him, over the next few days. The story spread like wildfire, but not the way it had before. News outlets that had mocked him now ran thoughtful pieces. When grief meets duty, the hidden cost of quiet service, why Clint Eastwood's words hit home for millions. Veterans groups shared his story, without his name, to highlight the need for better mental health support. A popular talk show host apologized on air for making light of the video. "We failed him," she said, "and we're sorry." His employer, Pacific Shield Security, issued a new statement. "We deeply regret our initial response. We are reinstating our team member with full support and are implementing mandatory mental wellness training for all staff." They even called him personally, not to ask for a statement, but to ask how they could do better. He accepted their apology, but more importantly, he accepted their offer to return, not just to his old post, but to help design the new wellness program. If my moment of weakness can help someone else feel less alone, he told them, then it wasn't weakness at all. Meanwhile, Clint didn't give interviews, didn't post about it on social media. He just went back to his quiet life, walking his dog, having coffee at the local diner, waving to neighbors. But people noticed, and they remembered. One afternoon, the man received a plain envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. You showed up when it mattered. That's the kind of courage no Oscar can measure. Keep going. Clerk. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his wallet, right behind his security badge. That same week, he finally agreed to one interview, not for fame, not for pity, but because he realized his story might help someone else who was drowning in silence. He sat in a small studio, no makeup, no script, just him and a kind-eyed journalist. What do you want people to understand? She asked. He thought for a long moment. That it's okay to not be okay, he said. That showing up even when you're falling apart is still showing up. And that asking for help isn't quitting. It's how you keep going. The segment aired on a Sunday morning. By Monday, his inbox was full, not with hate, but with messages from strangers, a nurse who cried in her car after a double shift, a teacher who hadn't slept in weeks, a young soldier home from deployment who said, I thought I was the only one. He answered everyone, and as he typed those replies, late into the night he realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was connecting. And that made all the difference. The world had tried to define him by one shaky moment. But Clint, and his own quiet courage, had rewritten the story. And America, for once, was listening. The morning after the interview aired, the man woke to a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, lonely kind that had filled his apartment for months, but a quiet hum of possibility. His phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, not with angry comments or news alerts, but with messages that felt like hands reaching out in the dark. A retired firefighter in Ohio wrote, I had my own moment like yours last year. Didn't think I'd make it through. Your words helped. A single mom in Texas said, I cried watching you. I've been hiding my anxiety from my kids for so long. Maybe it's time I stop. Even a young security guard in Chicago sent a shaky voice note. I saw the video before, and I thought I was the only one who felt like that on duty. Thank you. He read them slowly, one by one, his coffee going cold in the mug. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a cautionary tale. He felt like a bridge, but he didn't want to just be a symbol. He wanted to do something real. That afternoon, he met with the head of Pacific Shield Security, not in a sterile office with HR reps hovering, but at a quiet diner near the marina. The company rep, a woman who'd once signed his timesheets without ever learning his name, now looked him in the eye and said, We messed up, but we want to fix it with your help. They talked for hours, not about damage control, but about people, about how security work is more than checking IDs and standing in the rain. It's about being alert, present, and human, often while carrying invisible weights. They agreed on a plan, a new wellness initiative for all frontline staff, with confidential counseling, peer support groups, and training on recognizing signs of burnout. Not just in others, but in yourself. He'd be the face of it, not as a spokesperson, but as someone who'd lived it. No speeches, he told them. Just real talk, in the break room, over coffee, where it matters. Meanwhile, the ripple from Clint's words kept spreading. Schools began sharing the interview in health classes. A veterans nonprofit launched a hotline specifically for service members working in civilian security roles. Even the film festival organizers reached out, asking if he'd be willing to consult on safety protocols that included mental health check-ins for all event staff. We want to make sure no one feels alone on our team again, they said. He said yes to all of it, not because he wanted attention, but because he remembered how it felt to stand in that moment, gasping for air with no one seeing the real reason why. One evening, as he walked home from a planning meeting, he passed a group of teenagers outside the old theater. One of them held up his phone. Hey, the kid called out, not mockingly, but with something like respect. You're the guy from the gala, right? The one Clint Eastwood stood up for? He nodded, bracing for a joke. Instead, the teen said, My dad's a security guard at the mall. He never talks about work, but I think he's stressed. After seeing you, I think I'll ask him how he's really doing. The man stopped, looked at the kid. That's the best thing you could do, he said quietly. Just ask. He kept walking, but his chest felt lighter. This was the change he'd hoped for. Not headlines, but heart-to-hearts. Not fame, but connection. Back at his apartment, he opened his laptop and typed a letter. Not for the public, but for his son. He'd been meaning to write it for weeks, but hadn't known how to explain everything that had happened. Now the words came easy. I know you saw the worst part of this whole thing. The video, the jokes, the shame. But I want you to know something. Falling down doesn't mean you're weak. Getting back up even when your legs shake, that's where real strength lives. And I'm trying every day to show you that it's okay to be human, to hurt, to ask for help. Because you're not alone, and neither am I. He hit send before he could overthink it. His son called that night. They talked for over an hour, about college, about music, about nothing and everything. And near the end, his son said, I'm proud of you, Dad. 3 words that hit harder than any applause. As the weeks passed, the man settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were still early, but now he started them with a short walk along the beach, breathing in the salt air, letting the waves remind him that even the strongest tides have moments of stillness. He returned to duty, not at glitzy festivals, but at community centers, school events, local concerts. Places where people didn't expect perfection, just presence, and he brought something new with him, a small notebook in his pocket. Not for logs or reports, but for jotting down things people said when they thought no one was listening. My wife's sick. I haven't slept in days. I just need someone to notice. He'd follow up quietly, a cup of coffee left on a colleague's desk, a text checking in, a gentle nudge toward the new support line. He wasn't fixing the world, but he was helping his corner of it feel a little less cold. Then came the invitation he never expected. A national mental health advocacy group asked him to speak at their annual conference in Washington. TC not as a victim, but as a voice for frontline workers everywhere. We don't want a performance, they said. We want your truth, he almost said no. The thought of standing on a big stage under bright lights made his palms sweat. But then he remembered the teen outside the theater. The nurse who wrote from Ohio, his own son finally sleeping easier at night, so he said yes. He didn't prepare a speech. Just a few notes on a napkin. Be honest, be kind. Be human. The day of the event, the auditorium was packed, not with celebrities, but with counselors, social workers, teachers, nurses, veterans, and everyday people who'd spent their lives caring for others while quietly carrying their own pain. When he walked on stage, there were no cameras flashing, no red carpet, just a sea of faces that looked tired and hopeful. He took the mic, looked out at them, and said the simplest thing he could think of. I'm not here because I have answers. I'm here because I finally stopped pretending I had to. He talked about the panic attack not as a failure but as a signal, about how grief doesn't wear a uniform, but it shows up in your hands, your breath, your silence, about how asking for help isn't a sign you're broken, it's proof you're still fighting. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. They stood, slowly, one by one, until everyone was on their feet, not clapping but nodding. Some wiped their eyes. Others held hands. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment of shared understanding. Afterward, people lined up to talk to him, not for autographs, but for connection. A paramedic said, I've been hiding my anxiety for 10 years. Today, I called the support line. A teacher whispered, I'm going to tell my principal I need help. A young man in a security vest just hugged him and said, Thank you for making me feel seen. He stayed until the last person left. On the flight home, he stared out the window at the clouds below. He thought about how just a few months ago he'd believed his story was over. That one shaky moment had erased everything he'd built. Now he saw it differently. That moment hadn't ended his story. It had opened a door, for him and for others. Back in Carmel, life returned to its quiet pace. He resumed his shifts, attended planning meetings for the wellness program, and even started volunteering at a local veterans center, listening more than speaking. Clint never called again, not because he'd forgotten, but because he didn't need to. His message had been delivered. The rest was up to the man himself. One rainy afternoon, as he sat in the veterans center sipping bad coffee with a group of former service members, someone asked, Do you ever regret that moment at the festival? The one everyone saw? He thought about it, then shook his head. No, he said, because if I hadn't fallen, maybe none of this happens. Maybe someone out there stays silent a little longer. Maybe they don't reach out. So no, I don't regret it. I just wish I'd known sooner that it was okay to bend. The room fell quiet for a beat. Then one of the older vets raised his cup. To bending, he said, so we don't break. They all clinked their mugs together, and in that small, ordinary moment, something powerful lived, not in headlines or viral clips, but in the quiet courage of people choosing to be real with each other. America had been stunned, not by drama, but by dignity. And the real work, the human work, was just beginning. A year had passed since that morning on Ocean Avenue, the morning the world saw a man lean against a barricade and struggle to breathe. The video was still online, but it wasn't mocked anymore. It was linked in training manuals, shared in support groups, used in classrooms to teach empathy. What had once been a punchline had become a lesson. The man himself rarely thought about it now. He'd moved on, not by forgetting, but by building something new from the pieces. He still wore a uniform, but it wasn't just for guarding entrances anymore. These days, he spent his mornings at a community center near the old train depot, where security staff, EMTs, teachers, and delivery drivers came for coffee, quiet conversation, and something they hadn't always felt entitled to: care. The space was modest. Folding chairs, a donated coffee maker, a whiteboard with weekly support group times, but it hummed with a kind of warmth that no fancy office could replicate. He didn't run the place. He just showed up, listened. Sometimes shared his own story if someone looked like they needed to hear it. Other times he just sat with someone in silence, the way he wished someone had done for him. The wellness program he'd helped design with Pacific Shield had grown beyond Carmel. It was now used by security firms in 3 states with trained peer counselors, mental health days built into contracts, and a simple rule: if you're not okay, say it. No shame, no punishment. Turnover had dropped. Morale had risen. And more than a few people had later said, that program saved my life. He never took credit. He just kept showing up. Clint, true to form, stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no grand announcements. But every few months, a quiet donation would arrive at the community center, enough to fix the leaky roof, buy new chairs, or fund a counselor's training. Once, a plain envelope appeared in the man's mailbox with a single line: keep the light on. He knew who it was from. He didn't need a signature. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled along the sidewalk, the man arrived at the center early to set up for a new group session. He unlocked the door, flipped on the lights, and froze. On the small table by the window sat a framed photo. Not of a celebrity or a politician, but of him, in uniform, standing tall at a school event months earlier. Beside it was a small plaque that read, "For quiet courage that speaks louder than words." And leaning against the frame was a handwritten note on familiar cream-colored paper: strength isn't never falling. It's getting back up and helping others do the same. See. He stood there for a long time, the morning sun warming his back. He didn't cry, but something settled deep inside him, a quiet peace like a storm finally passing. Later that day, during the group session, a young woman spoke up. She'd been a campus security officer for 2 years. Her voice trembled as she admitted she'd been having panic attacks before every shift. "I thought I was failing," she said, like I wasn't strong enough for the job. He looked at her and said gently, "You're not failing. You're feeling. And that doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and around the circle others leaned in, offering quiet words of support. No judgment, just understanding. That was the real victory. Not the headlines, not the viral moment, but this. A room full of people who once hid their pain, now holding space for each other's healing. As the months rolled on, life settled into a rhythm that felt honest. He still worked shifts, still paid bills, still missed her, especially on rainy Sundays. But the weight wasn't crushing anymore. It was just part of him, like a scar that reminded him he'd survived. His son graduated from high school that spring. At the ceremony, as the young man walked across the stage, he scanned the crowd until he found his father and gave him a small, proud wave. Afterward, they hugged longer than usual. "You taught me it's okay to be real," his son said. "That's worth more than any degree." He smiled. "You taught me I wasn't alone." They ate ice cream on the pier that evening, watching the sun sink into the Pacific. No grand speeches. Just two people side by side breathing the same salt air. Back at the community center, the work continued. New faces came. Old ones returned. Some found their footing and moved on. Others stayed, becoming peer supporters themselves. The man never pushed. He just made sure the coffee was hot and the door was open. One afternoon, a reporter from a national magazine asked if he'd consider writing a short essay about his journey. "Not for fame," she said, "but because your story helps people feel less ashamed." He thought about it, then agreed, but only if it ended with a question. Who in your life might need to hear today, "It's okay not to be okay"? The piece ran quietly, tucked between features on climate and tech. But letters poured in, not from celebrities, but from grocery store clerks, bus drivers, nurses, parents. People who'd never thought their struggles mattered. Now they knew they weren't alone, and that, he realized, was the legacy, not his name in lights, but the quiet ripple of one person choosing compassion over judgment. Years later, long after the festival, the video and the headlines had faded from public memory, a new generation of security trainees would watch a short film during orientation. It showed a man in a Navy uniform standing in the early morning light, then leaning against a barricade, breathing hard. But the narration didn't mock. It said, "This is what courage looks like when no one's applauding. This is why we care for each other." The man never saw that film. He didn't need to. He lived it every day. In his small apartment, the framed photo from Clint still sat on his desk, next to a worn copy of a veteran's resource guide and a coffee mug with a chip on the rim. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that one act of decency can change the course of a life. He never became famous, never sought the spotlight, but in the lives he touched, in the young officer who called the support line, the teacher who finally took a mental health day, the father who hugged his son without shame, he left something far more lasting than fame. One evening, as he locked up the community center for the night, he paused on the sidewalk. The street was quiet. The ocean whispered in the distance. He looked up at the stars, same ones that had watched over him on that dark morning a lifetime ago. He took a deep breath. Not shaky, not forced, just calm. Then he walked home, hands in his pockets, heart at peace, and somewhere, in a quiet house among the cypress trees, an old man smiled to himself, knowing he'd done the right thing, not by speaking loudly, but by seeing clearly. The story didn't end with a bang. It ended with a door left open, a cup of coffee offered, a hand reached out in the dark, and in a world that often celebrates perfection, that quiet humanity stunned America, not once but every single day it was lived.